This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host Josh, and with us is your other host Puka. Say hi, Puka.
Squiddly-dee-doo-be-dee.
What are we talking about today, Puka?
We are diving into the vast and timeless oceans of the World of Darkness as we crack open Blood-Dimmed Tides, a
Yes.
World of Darkness sourcebook. Not a Changeling sourcebook.
Yeah, we'll get into this. Is actually a World of Darkness sourcebook, not a 2 games in the World of Darkness sourcebook. Yeah, or 3 games, or anyway, we'll get into that.
Not many of which actually deal with Changeling that much, so it is refreshing to have one which does.
Yeah, I don't really know the names. I know who Ethan Skemp is, but
Yeah. I am curious who wrote the Changeling material in this because Ethan Skemp, I assume, did some at some point. I just can't think of when. And then the others, maybe Adam Tinworth did? I don't recognize. I can't remember who's written what at this point.
I suspect it was more than one author, depending on which bits you're talking about. There's one little unimportant but niggling bit where they keep using different definitions of Kithane,
Hmm.
and I'm wondering if some were written by different people that way. But
Potential. In any case, shall we continue diving into it? We can keep using diving metaphors.
I'm not digging. Yeah.
So we start with a story. It's like a creepy ghost ship story thing, which I didn't entirely follow all the stuff that happened in it, but it's nice. It's atmospheric, as such stories go. Short too.
Yep. Then we get the introduction, Rising Tides.
Maybe we should mention that we aren't going to be doing a chapter by chapter exhaustive all things in this book discussion because as a World of Darkness book, there's also plenty about underwater vampires and were sharks and mages who live undersea and drowned ghosts and things like that. All of which are cool, but don't necessarily have a direct bearing on Changeling games unless you want to go in a crossover direction.
Yep. Although this book is also very tilted towards crossover, I would say. Not that you have to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, as you put it, it's a book with material for vampire, material for wraith, and material for a werewolf made changeling.
Yep. All 3 World of Darkness games. The original 3.
Yeah. Some of it hangs together reasonably well. I would say possibly even better than some of the landlubber crossover stuff that they've done. But I also think the changeling material can hold on its own maybe more easily than some of the other game lines material in here. It's difficult, I would say, to run an entirely undersea vampire game.
Yeah, it's more like a shoreline antagonist vampire game, maybe. But
anyway, introduction.
Yeah, the introduction, I think it explained what to do with this book, and I think it successfully explained what to do with this book. So, nothing too deep, but...
A bit at the top of page 11 says, World of Darkness Blood-Dimmed Tides can be used in one of 2 primary ways, to take your usual group of characters into the ocean for the space of a story or 2, or to run a story, or possibly even a chronicle, in a primarily aquatic setting, with characters such as merfolk or void engineers. And that's kind of my guiding metric for did this book achieve what it set out to.
Yep.
There's also this weird blurb at the end where it's like, oh, it could be easy to fall into the Aquaman syndrome, and you might have players making Red Lobster jokes. And I'm thinking, wait, who does that? Why is this
Hey, the Aquaman thing, that's before Jason Momoa played Aquaman, so...
Fair, but it just seems strange that they're, did the authors have a peculiarly high rate of people mocking ocean-themed role-playing in there? I don't know. But they say they're going to try to convince us otherwise, and I don't know that I need convincing. I'm on board with this topic.
I encountered gamers, I would say, given when this was written in the late 90s, I actually can see why they did that.
But all right. I never met them, but...
Yeah.
They also mention a couple media items for inspiration, which includes The Abyss, which I'm very glad to see on there, because I love The Abyss.
A bunch of Lovecraft, yeah. Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
And this was pre-Pirates of the Caribbean, but that also... Anyway.
And then you get a picture which appears to be Wolverine from the X-Men holding a merfolk.
A very buxom merfolk.
Well, we'll get into that. I'd say she's a typically buxom merfolk based on later description.
Fair. Yeah, there's a lot of toplessness in this book.
Yeah,
Take note.
which I think compared to just sticking seashells on for no reason.
Hmm. We get some notes on the great chain of being, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a food chain of being, with the merfolk and the rokea, the were sharks, grottos, which are like cairns or nodes or freeholds that supply energy,
Mm-hmm.
and my personal favorite, the rorquals, because
Yeah,
they're whales, but they're also freeholds.
and also there's a sidebar on playing making them as player characters, which like
Functionally useless as a
yes.
sidebar.
Yeah, it does not actually. Even if I said, "Oh, I want one of these as a player character in my game," I'm going to do some game development to make that actually make any
Right.
sense. They don't have enough here.
All I'm going to say is we are making concerted efforts to try creating more Patreon content, and mechanics for Rorqual is right at the top of my
Hmm.
list for this book.
And this actually gets into the interesting thing, bringing up like the werewolf mage changeling bit. Like the Rorqual are, we'll get into it later, but they function as freeholds for the merfolk, but they also function as cairns for the were sharks and other things like that. So it's like it's a lot more crossovery in that regard, I think, for
Mm,
change than like a land changeling game where a cairn and a freehold are very rarely going to be the same play. I mean, you have this some stuff with glades maybe, but even then, usually not going
yeah,
to be related. So,
yeah. I don't want to say it's a forced option for crossover
hmm,
games, but it is a very convenient packaged one to have
yeah,
different splats fighting over a mobile whale freehold,
yeah.
whale
This
cairn.
whole thing feels a little bit more like leaning towards the direction eventually Chronicles of Darkness took, with like
Yeah,
more crossover friendly, I guess. And then we get sections on all the world oceans.
yes.
Uh,
I guess the relevant ones for our purposes are the Atlantic in terms of the Mediterranean, because that's where the merfolk hang out around the coastlines a lot. It does also mention that in the Baltic Sea, the only Fae are Selkies hiding in the Gulf of Bothnia, and I'm like, surely not.
Well, this brings into another World of Darkness thing we haven't brought up in the show, which I had forgotten about, and I really don't like the Baba Yaga Iron Curtain thing,
Hmm.
which was generally avoided for Changeling, but it's sort of coming in here, and it's like,
I guess they had to work around it because
yeah.
World of Darkness book.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
there's that a little bit going on.
Yeah. We get information about Project Deepwater in the Pacific Ocean and
Hmm.
how they, I guess, destroyed. It's kind of unclear whether it's destroyed entirely or just like forced abandoned the coral city of Xinkux.
Yeah, because they took over the huge source of energy, magical, mystical energy in the
Yes.
Marianas Trench.
But they're potentially controlled by fish beasts or something, which we'll get to.
Yeah, and that is definitely ties into the changeling side of this. One thing about this game we talked before about, does this need updating from a moral perspective? This just highlights how much, especially like the Arctic section and things like that, climate change is not just climate change, but that's a big part of it, has really impacted just how they describe the mortal world. They're like, oh, the Arctic Sea is totally generally impassable, and all. I'm like, oh, that's governments aren't that interested. I'm like, this is very different now. Like, a lot
Yeah.
of,
And again, the world of darkness is not our world, but you know,
yeah, that aspect of it, I'd feel like if this was published now, it would definitely be a lot more highlighted because it's
yeah.
World of Darkness is not our world, but the bad stuff in our world is supposed to be in it. So,
A couple days before this recording, there's an unverified water temperature in the triple digits Fahrenheit for the first time ever in history that's been
oh,
recorded and is being investigated. But that's where we're at.
yeah,
Sit with that for a second. But anyway,
nice little sidebar on Atlantis. Basically saying we're not covering it, but you can add it to your game if you want.
so it's not Chronicles of Darkness then. Okay.
No.
I do kind of dig the suggestion that Atlantis and other sunken cities are actually in the dreaming, though. I
Hmm.
mean, like the idea of entire cities just being pulled into it whole is such a great idea.
Yeah. Just put all the sunken cities in the dreaming, like all of
Yeah,
them.
the city of Is, and maybe also that the hidden parts of the ocean are kind of like shallowings into the dreaming, where you can
Hmm.
just step across.
And all the Umbras, including the deep
Yeah.
Umbra. But
Well, that we actually there are
yeah.
parts where it says the gauntlet is a rating 2 or a 1 at certain
Hmm.
points. So they also mention at some point the freehold boats of the Minhune, and I'm like, I don't recall that, but I love it, and it
Hmm.
it makes a kind of sense given that a lot of the Polynesian voyages in history, if I remember correctly, were kind of just these long weeks or months at a time. You'd have to be on the sea. So if you're taking a balefire from one place to another. So let's run with that. I like that.
Yep.
Get plenty of info on pirates.
Mm-hmm.
I say plenty. I really mean not nearly enough.
Yep.
Someday I'll write that pirates book.
A lot about the horror of underwaterness.
Yeah. A lot of this is just so wraith and vampire heavy, though. It's like,
yeah, the vampire heavies, the wraith bit, I kind of see why they do that. But
and also like eldritch Lovecraftian horror to cut across all splats.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of ink dedicated to that as well. But we do get the notes that the mer. Can we say the mer as like a general catch-all term?
Sure.
They live in the so-called twilight zone, down to about 4 kilometers under the water, and they're rarely found within 100 miles of land. So they basically steer clear of the continental shelf for the most part. This does, however, directly contradict the earlier notes that they hang out around coastlines in the Mediterranean, and the sidebar here where they talk about Old Cape May, New Jersey. Hey, represent.
Yeah, I think they meant most of them hang out.
Most of them, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the case is, I think most land-based characters will not be like encountering their first merfolk by going 200 miles out to sea and 3 kilometers down.
Oh, one thing that's definitely not mentioned at all whatsoever is any sort of an anime. Even the earlier anime stuff we got before an anime, The Secret Way. So,
and I think this was written after in anime, so again raises the question of maybe it was in development for long enough that nobody thought about like, oh, at the other end of the office they're writing about undines, we should probably include those.
Yep. And they have a undersea triad, which is another crossover thing, and it's like, well, the Kithane like mer are associated with basically the wild, and the Thalian like mer are associated with the worm, sort of, or the sea version of the wild and the worm. Yeah.
And the Weaver just kind of chills in the background being intellectual. Yeah. The shelled one, Vatea and Dagon for the other two, the fish father and the tentacled one. There's also notes about how other kiths might get involved in watery adventures. It says some Slua claim to be able to live underwater for long periods of time, and knockers occasionally build leaky Jules Verne-esque contraptions. But that Ishu and aquatic puka are more liable to be journeying a considerable distance.
And this sort of highlights also another thing that I was talking about different authors. Like, this bit has nothing about Selkies, but later chapters talk a lot about Selkies. So not a lot, but definitely bring them up.
There's also the mention here that the Project Deepwater reaching the bottom of the Mariana Trench and rupturing their coral city, because it's almost like a second shattering that radiated banality out through their culture, but that it wiped out 2/3 of them. I'm like, holy Christmas.
Yeah. It's still implied that the mer greatly outnumber the Kithane in numbers, which is just...
I guess so.
Yeah, which, given the other things I've worked out about numbers of Kithane, it would imply like the mer outnumber all other supernatural guys.
2/3, though. I mean, like, that's a lot. The only, I guess, relevant part of the Umbrus stuff, in the sense that it crosses over with the merfolk, is when it talks about the Apsare, which are the, quote, bizarre spirits that govern the creatures of the sea. And they tend to be in the form of the boned and the unboned, so bony fish and not bony fish. And I'd like to use the word ichthyocracy here to talk about them as the governors of the sea or whatever, but they're relevant to the merfolk because they inform the fey mean of those kiths. And then there's just more about Project Deepwater and the deleterious effects it has on various supernaturals. It plunders the oceans for Pentech and the technocracy, and acts as a breeding ground for the undersea abominations called the Chulorvia, as well as just being poisonous and polluting.
Then we get to denizens, which is as much word count as you could possibly need for vampires in the ocean. If you want to run a vampire game in the ocean, here you got a lot more. You'll have more later.
I will point out, I think the Changeling section is almost as long as the other ones combined.
I do still wish the mer... I don't know if they introduce, but they get into the Rokea here.
Yeah.
Which are the were sharks. And they do later get their own book. These says this one coming up, but I'm like, why don't the mer get their own book?
Well, we'll have to work with what we have, which is not an inconsiderable amount. I mean, it's almost like a very short Kithbook embedded in here. So the section opens with a creepy ass story about divers finding a Maruka spawning ground, and I remember being really creeped out by that in my youth when I was
Those,
reading
those
them.
are the basically thaline or
Yes.
ish.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Ish. They're not quite the same as thaline, but
And they reproduce by laying clutches of orangey eggs in corpses,
mhm.
which is pretty gross.
Preferably human.
Preferably human. Preferably humans that they've drowned with a kiss.
Mhm.
And then it sort of, it is a little bit jarring that it goes from this like third person story of these divers stumbling across the nest and then getting trapped and turned into fish bait, and then like immediately cuts to the diary of some random sluit in New York.
Hmm. Yeah. Embedded, by the way, there's one thing in the Wraith section. If you really want naval artillery or navigation abilities, that you can pull that.
Noted. So we have this diary of
Hmm.
what's his name, Draper the Slua, talking about being at the Winter Court in Manhattan when two merfolk walk in, Lady Qualissa and Lord Shul, and they arrive to ask for assistance from the Kithane because Project Deepwater has decimated them and threatens their glamour, etc. And everyone laughs and points and calls them fish. So then the Slua is like, hey, let's listen to what they have to say and help them out. And so he gets assigned to be their envoy or whatever. And through his narration, we get the whole cosmology, mythology, history, society lesson of the merfolk.
Do you know what's funny? I've mentioned before the October Day series
Mhm.
by Shannon McGuire. I think she read this book.
I think she read all of these books.
Yes, because that also, the way the mer work there are not completely dissimilar to this, unless they're from the same sources. But I don't know what those sources are. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Mhm.
So we have this origin story where the brothers Vatea and Dagon created merfolk and Marucha, similar to Kithane and Thalane. They were affected by banality, which they call the cold. I don't know that it spells out exactly when the sundering like started
Mhm.
or when the shattering kind of took hold for them, but I imagine that once sail travel really started picking up in earnest, that was kind of like the moment.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an underwater sea people, concepts of years to keep track of might
Right,
be
yeah.
less relevant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But they eventually learned the Changeling Way from the Selkies, although their version of the Changeling Way basically involved mass abductions of sailors, like
Hmm.
sinking ships and then breeding with the
Yeah, I think they
survivors.
implied they tried a more Kithane-like Changeling way for a while, but adapted it.
Yeah, and then they're like, nah, let's just mess some ships up.
Hmm. And then they stopped it and just lived with the population of changelings having kids with changelings.
Yes, because they eventually secured enough breeding stock to keep up their population on their own so that they
Yep.
didn't need to interact with humans anymore.
Hmm.
So then, when the humans reached the Mariana Trench, that was the drowning. And it's almost like an anti resurgence, because I think that was also in the 60s when Jacques
Yep.
Cousteau got down there.
Yeah, they didn't have the resurgence, from what I can tell, at all. Anything like it.
Yeah.
Oh, we also learned that kissing is very intimate compared to sex. But,
Yeah, sex is totally fine, but no kissing.
yep.
I do like that there's a Maruja sidebar where they sort of give their perspective of like
Hmm.
their origin story.
Yeah, I'd say this. Like, if you were running a Merfolk game, the way this presented the differences, it's more like Gwydion and She and Redcap than like Thalane and Kithane in terms of their interactions. It seems, but like you
But
could,
there's three houses. It's like
yeah,
Gwydion and Skara and I don't know, Dougal.
yeah, we'll get into that. But I just meant the way the darker one,
The Maruja.
Maruka are,
Maruja. The Marrow. They're also called Marrow
yeah,
in here, so we can go with that.
yeah, the Marrow are more somewhere in between Seelie and Unseelie mixing, and but like a bit more extreme than that, but not as extreme as Kithane and Thalane is what I mean. Like between the two
Mhm.
cultures.
Importantly, when they hatch, they are indistinguishable for the first
Hmm.
year. When they
And it
are.
sounds like they have this process where they go
Yes.
from being a baby, and it sounds like they could go either way depending on which animal swims in. So,
Well, getting into those specifics, we get
yeah.
notes about how the Apsare are relevant for the merfolk.
Hmm.
So, after the first year of a Nereid's life, Nereid being the, I guess, childling equivalent in this.
It says childling, but it's baby.
Yeah, they're very small.
They're not playable.
No, then the parents leave their kid in a grotto, which is like a glade, and wait until the first creature that happens by enters. And then whatever that creature is, that I guess bonds with the fey mean of the baby merfolk and determines whether they're a merfolk or a
Yep.
marucha. and if they're a merfolk, what house they are.
And interestingly, there's nothing about discouraging unwanted sea creatures from going in.
It's true, although it does say later that with the Marucha, if a non-spiny or gross thing enters, they'll often abandon or kill the
Yeah,
infant.
which kind of implies that's one of the reasons maybe why the Marucha have more of them than the other
Yeah.
the Merfolk.
I guess it sort of fills in the rest of the Fae soul. Like the merfolk with whom the Slua narrator is talking says that they don't feel complete until they've bonded with their Apsara. We don't get a lot of specifics about like how to actually mechanize that, but I'm okay with that. There's information about their society. They're all nobles on the merfolk side. All of them. Every single one. Not a source of conflict whatsoever.
Yeah, although I don't think they have any sort of title.
Not really, no. Well, and they're all like artists who just kind of hang out and have lots of free time. They're not really invested in
Yeah,
politicking.
they're the nobility, and the commoners are the land folk, and they don't like them.
Yeah. They are also matriarchal.
Mhm.
Very much so.
Although not hardcore. Like, I wouldn't say they're like men and have it really bad or anything. Just, yeah.
That we know of.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of examples. I wish we had more, but what we do have is full of stuff. So
It's true. So then Draper the Slua gets to go undersea. We see a bit of the Marucha in one of their nests. He visits the coral city of Kuzua in the Hudson Trench off of New York's coast. Some really beautiful descriptions in here of the coral cities. I do quite like these. And there's like a list of other ones. There's one off Southern California, the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Ireland. So they seem to have a few outposts conveniently placed for wherever your mostly land based chronicle has been hitherto set. It ends with this little oh no epilogue, which just didn't really land well at all.
I actually literally could not read it from the font.
Honestly, the least interesting part of this entire sort of story was like Draper's tone as like the Slua learning about all this stuff, getting all offended that they're so self-important, but then he's so amazed by their city and decides he needs to help them out, but then oh
And,
no, there's that unseelie lord, and I'm like, yeah, just tell me more about their society. I don't need any of
yeah,
this.
and there's kind of there's a plot line basically because of that whole deep water thing with it's a technocracy Pentex joint venture, but not involving anyway. I won't do the main stuff, but they're like all in danger, and they're like so desperate they're asking the Kithane for help, and the Kithane are like, "Who are you?"
Yeah,
But it seems like yeah, they sort of the plot line that they're going through here is the same one that they suggest for getting involved. If you're playing Kithane but want to involve the Mer, which is asking for help, and maybe your PCs are the only ones willing to do
yeah,
anything.
which is fine, but there's limited space in this book, and I felt like more time was taken
Hmm.
up with like the Slua's reaction shots than
Yeah,
than I really needed.
it's
But
not leaving enough to
right,
like we said. Like the anime felt like they didn't quite give enough to fully flesh it out. This is even less for that, where you're like, how am I making a game focused on this?
yeah, and there's also big art once we
Hmm.
flip the page.
To the merfolk.
Yes. So, what are some important deets that we should mention?
They're all really pretty.
Yep, they harvest their glamour from the sea rather than humans.
Well, but they can harvest from humans. So they say like they're
They
perfectly
can, yeah.
capable of doing all the other, at least the human. This predates some of the other things, but yeah, they can ravage or whatever, but they just
Right.
generally don't.
It's just they rarely have humans around
Yeah,
whom they can.
yeah, they're interesting way of enchanting or bringing people underwater with breast milk.
We'll get to that.
Yep.
Um, there's a lifestyle section where it has the sentence: "The Mare are simultaneously deadly serious and playful, highly ritualized and completely free spirited, repressed and
Hmm.
yet libidinous as a drunken prom date." And I'm
Yep.
like, that sums it up, I
Yeah,
suppose.
they give a broad sketches of a fairly alien society, but that would still be playable. So
I did like the world that the Mare inhabit has just enough banality to stave off total bedlam. Outside of that, it's
mhm.
all for the most part free time.
Yep. No, and Mer Relations has land-based Kithane, aquatic puka, selkies, menehune, water babies, and I can't pronounce the other.
Yunuyame Yunehi.
Yep, the sort of freshwater nunahi, and other prodigals. I'm like, that's an interesting.
Most of whom they don't like.
Yeah,
or at least they seem to pity the land Kithane,
Mm-hmm.
barely tolerate aquatic puka, aren't really sure what to make of the Selkies. They like the Minihune. They've heard of water-based Nunyihi, and any prodigal who's not a Rokea, they despise. So,
Mm-hmm. They kind of just have Wilders and Grumps, and they don't give enough information to play the Grumps, called the
Nixes and
Nogs.
Naugs instead.
Yeah, and Nogs. There's not enough information. I'm like, what? They
Yeah.
have long hair and they're retired. Okay, that's
They really want you to play a Wilder, and that's it.
yeah.
There is the helpful note that while they're alien and seductive with fey means that reflects their apsare, when they go onto land, their tails do indeed split into legs, and their human forms are tall, lithe, and hairless.
Yep.
They worship Vitea and only mate among their own kind, and their young need that enchanted milk to survive their first year.
Yeah. Also, the only mate with their own kind appears to also be a. It's like them using in. They could. They just generally
Right.
don't. Their birthrights are. They get some extra attribute depending on their thing.
I actually didn't check to see if these are the same as in C20, but I'm going to pull that up
Yeah.
real quick and just have a look-see.
Which can take their whatever attribute of a 5. It's like somewhere between their own kith and something more broad. They all have gills, or they're not gills necessarily, but they're good at underwater. They're very pretty, which some of them could get 2 dots of appearance. Apparently, marlins fish are very hot. So, and
Okay.
oh, and can't botch appearance rolls.
It is basically the same as in C20, I believe.
Yeah, and the coldness frailty confuses me. It says they're more vulnerable to banality because if their glamour gets to 0, they stop being enchanted. I'm like, what? Like,
Yeah,
that
well,
was
so
weird.
I guess this works a little bit better in second edition, where you can absorb a point of temporary banality by spending a point of glamour.
But also, like, I'm a little bit confused because, yeah, I'm like, that's not quite.
Yeah, it confused me too.
Is that still in C20, that same coldness?
It's similar. It just says Azamir accumulates banality and loses glamour,
Yeah.
which is basically the same as Azamir's glamour decreases. So
Hmm. And they have trouble taking certain abilities, like Streetwise and Drive and Firearms or Computer. Although, no Streetwise says something weird about Mer Society, but.
and then the Maruja, or Marrow.
Hmm. Where the males are ugly and see through skin, but the women one can still be as attractive.
Yes. Unlike the live-bearing Sealy merfolk, the unseelie Maruja lay clutches of eggs, of which only a few survive.
Hmm.
It's interesting that they're also called Nuks and Sirens, the males and the
Hmm.
females, because it's like the Nukalavi. And we have the Morganid in C20, so I'm curious how they kind of align or disalign with these baddies.
Yeah. Their birthrights are pretty similar, but
Except that they cause shock with their hideousness rather than dazzling awe
yeah,
with their beauty.
even the attractive ones.
Yes. And they, even though they're horrific looking, that doesn't mean they're not intelligent. They have
Yeah.
a primal cunning and they can be deadly.
They seem to have a better integration with land-based faith than the because at least from their stereotypes, at least the one there, it's just they always give like one example, so who knows what the other feel. But
It seems like they're more willing to encounter them than the
yeah,
merfolk are.
and they're having this trouble with the deep water thing too. They're not on
Yes.
side with it, and they get along with the winter Unihi much better.
But to your point about the deep water issue, I mean, part of that sort of mini meta plot in here about the sea fae coming up out of the water to ask for help,
Mm-hmm.
the two groups here, the merfolk and the merrow, have set aside temporarily their differences. So there is a
Mm-hmm.
truce in place, or at
Yep.
least that's the implication. Otherwise, they clash frequently.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's more like red caps and
Yeah,
Whittian or something.
yeah. But I kind of like games too where even Kithane and Thalane grudgingly find occasions to work together.
Yeah, that's less presented in the books, but I like that
Yeah,
too.
yeah. I do like, just as a cosmological note, where it says the Maruja believe that they were born when Dagon crashed into the sea and took a piece of the sky from his mouth and put it into a bubble of foam that arose from his crash site.
I just realized, unless I missed it, this book says nothing about picking legacies or starting tempers.
I guess you just kind of have to assume that the wilder rules apply.
Yeah.
So yes, the Dagon thing. They also believe that Vitea's children, the merfolk, have usurped their proper dominance of the oceans. So for the sidebar on merfolk as player characters, there's some useful bits in here, I guess. They suggest
Mm-hmm.
things like having a group of mer traveling inland to find aid, or you can have land-based Kithane on a boat, or they can live by the coast, or maybe they find a lone mer outcast or foundling. Various ways to get them into your game.
Yeah, as somebody who tends to run games set where they live and have never lived on the coast, it makes it harder for me to.
They could get up to St. Lawrence. A
Yeah.
fair piece, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's getting very fresh water though. But
Yeah. Then we get some houses, because they're all nobles.
mm-hmm.
There's House Lorelei, the representation of Dagon and the Triad.
Which are super good at fighting, but frenzy when they smell blood.
Yes. Melusine, who represent the Shelled One, intellectuals and architects and
But
artists.
not the shelled fish. They're
Not the shelled fish, right.
no, they're all the like mammals and stuff, right?
Cetaceans.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or sea turtles or birds even. They don't have one of the flaws essentially, so they can take whatever abilities and they can breathe air, but only need to every 6 hours. So,
Well, but that's a flaw for them because they have to
mm-hmm.
breathe air. So they have to surface.
Yeah,
And then Syrinx, the chosen of Vitaea, and they're the extra pretty and extra capricious leaders among the nobles.
and most of them are those.
Yes, the nobles among the nobles.
Mm-hmm.
And they can control sea creatures like Aquaman.
Yep.
But then they lose willpower when they're out of the water. So, interesting. And I think that these were not represented in C20, so cool to
Mm-hmm.
see them.
And we get new arts.
Yes. I do like the bunk advice. It says a level 3 merfolk bunk may be shoot to the surface and splash mightily out of the water, while its Maruka
Mm-hmm.
counterpart would be something along the lines of find something with more legs than you and eat it while it's still wriggling.
Mm-hmm.
I dig it. But we have Aphrodisia, the art of desire,
Yep.
which they did teach to a few satyrs back in the day.
And that's interestingly, we'll get it to eventually when you do the Shining Host Player's Guide, the art book.
Mm.
In that book, but not mer related.
Yeah. Is it
Same as
satyr focused?
Cryos. And, no, it's just like, well, I mean, maybe some say it's just like Aphrodisia, Cryos, and Skycraft are just sort of like, yeah, like, it's just Kithane arts, just less common.
Yeah. Well, Cryos being the ice manipulation art, which
Mm-hmm.
some trolls try to learn.
And it's -1 difficulty underwater for Cryos. It's interesting.
I really like that there are those little mechanical bits for the
Me
arts,
too.
and I wish we had more of those. So, just saying. Skycraft is Skycraft. That one,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's changed a little bit in C20, but
Yeah, the other two got wrapped into other seasonal arts, but this one,
yeah.
Skycraft.
I mean, Aphrodisia, it's really just variations on the same theme. And it's all in summer now, whereas Cryos, I guess, is in winter.
Yeah.
I did notice that Aphrodisia were all chimerical and Cryos were all weird and Skycraft were all either, which I thought was intriguing. But yeah, that's what the merfolk do. Desire, ice, storms.
Mm-hmm. And then we get new treasures.
All right, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the first one.
Okay, so it's mermaid's milk. It's the breast milk of both mer, or just the
mer, yeah, because
just
the marrow don't. Well, no, I guess it could be either.
Yeah, but they talk about it. A gallon jug contains no more than 5 points worth. I'm like, this is implying some sort of industry that really hurts my head in terms of what that would look like.
Listen, humans have an industry for it too. So.
Yeah. Actually, does it say they have to like anything around pregnancy, or is it like they can just excrete it? Anyway.
Well, I mean, the ladies among the merfolk are endowed similarly to the land-based ones.
But do they have to be like only in their certain part of the reproductive cycle, or is it like all the time?
Well, I assume if they have a kid,
Yeah.
then they have to nourish it. So
yeah, it didn't get into that level of detail.
Anyway, various people have commented on being squicked by this idea of the mermaid's milk.
Yeah. I'm not squicked by the concept. The way the writing was in this, though, I'm like, the writer was very enthusiastic in parts in ways that made me a little bit like,
I don't know. I mean, it only came up like twice.
Well, not just this part, just in general, like how sexy they are because they're fish people.
Yeah, but that is the folklore, so I don't blame them for that. Maybe they were a little bit more into it than some of us would be. But
yeah.
Anyway, that's the level 1 treasure. So.
Yep. Level 2 treasure is a weapon. It's a trident.
I like level 3, Melusine's mirror.
Yeah, that one's neat. It shows the basic nature of things.
Yeah. Level 4 is cool, the Conch of Poseidon, where you can suck up a storm and then blast it out later by blowing on the shell.
Mm-hmm.
And then a coral comb that lets you comb out the ugly,
Yep.
changing permanent glamour into permanent appearance dots. Pretty cool, I guess. And I like that as an example of a treasure which doesn't really correspond to a specific art, you know?
Yeah. Even a C20, some of the treasures don't, so that's fine. But
Yeah. Anyway, that's the merfolk section. Overall thoughts for those 20 odd pages?
I generally like it. There's a few little tonal things maybe I'd shift, but like in general, there's nothing like terrible in it. I'd like more, and
Mm-hmm. You'd like mirror.
yeah, I want a whole book. That's my.
Yeah.
But I get why when it was published why that didn't happen.
And it hits all the pieces of like a Kithbook. I mean, it doesn't have
Yeah,
templates and it doesn't have famous merfolk.
yeah.
Like,
I have some questions like how legacies work. Are there anything like Celia and Unseelie for anything? What are their tempers? I have some questions. Like, there's some basic
yeah.
mechanics questions not entered. We don't have a character sheet in here,
Yeah,
but
fair points. But ultimately, I mean,
yeah, it's mostly just lack of information, not
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
information's bad.
They probably could have squeezed in another page or two of content just by like cutting down on the art a bit and cutting down on the asides and the
Yeah,
opening story a bit.
and even the arts are like they're kind of cool, but like
I don't mind them just as a space consideration. I'd rather have more
yeah, if
text.
I'd rather have had take out one of the arts and then put more on them. It's
Yeah.
like basic.
Well, yeah, that's fair.
And then speaking of art, after that, the between chapters is a very confusing for me to work out what I'm seeing picture.
I think it's were sharks fighting a giant eldritch squid beast.
Yeah, but like exactly which bits are which. I think part of that's because you get a hammerhead shark person with an eye. Anyway,
The fact that it's black and white line art does it no favors.
yep. And we get storytelling advice, which is. Do
Yes.
you have thoughts on this?
It's useful, I think.
Okay, I found it kind of
Do you think it restates the obvious too much?
yeah, and also things that have already been stated before.
It does have the useful note that not every square mile of ocean hosts a supernatural entity,
Hmm.
and that it's difficult to impossible for a supernatural entity to truly control territory, especially in 3 dimensions.
Yeah,
So I did like that.
yeah, it's just way so much more space
Yeah.
than dealing with land games that it's things like the way that our brains work only makes sense on land, so it's like interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, anyway.
Do you think it would be helpful if the book dug more into alienness as a theme?
Yeah, I think so. At least the alienness of environment,
Yeah.
which they had, but maybe a bit more on that.
Well, and they do as the two moods they suggest, they do have mystique and helplessness, but the mystique part they kind of clumsily contrast it with the reality of sea life. And then helplessness,
Hmm.
it's not for its own sake, but as part of like a horror story trope. And the alienness doesn't really fit well into either of those. I do think
Hmm.
the advice they give about really bringing those moods to life with descriptive language, because that's always what you should do when you want to highlight mood, that could be helpful for emphasizing how different the setting is.
Yeah,
So,
and there's really multiple settings here because you have
mhm.
shoreline, you have surface, and then you have underwater, and multiple underwater kind of settings. But
And how that shakes out in all of the different oceans.
yeah, it's just such a vast setting.
Mm-hmm. Theme wise, they focus on the unknown and vastness. The latter,
Hmm.
again, because it's good for horror, for protagonists to feel in over their heads.
Hmm.
But then for the unknown, I did think the suggestions here were sensible, talking about things like, hey, there's actually not that much light once you get down far enough, so limit your character's senses and what they're able to perceive.
Yeah,
You can introduce bizarre creatures.
and interestingly, okay, so this book, the Changeling, most of the Changeling specific stuff in this book focuses on the Mer.
Hmm.
But those are kind of the only. I mean, there's some Rokea too, but those on the Rokea are like the only really player character options where this would be natural for them. This would be their actual default setting. So stuff for the other game lines, it's mostly like you are in a more alien environment. Maybe you're adapted well to it, maybe you're not.
Hmm.
And mostly it's like talking about NPCs you'd encounter, and a lot of that would be useful for you for running a Changeling game. I think
Yeah.
even stuff from some of the other games would be handy, like even especially like some of that stuff about mages. It's like, oh, there's like the Sons of Ether underwater submarines. I'm like, the Hawkers would make those. Come on, too, but things like that. So
Yeah. Fair points. Well, on the subject of story ideas, we do get a few of those here.
hmm
If you have landlubber protagonists, the story can center on them going to sea intentionally as a group, perhaps to advance a specific character's subplot. It might just be a one-shot visit for a change in environment, or it could be an ongoing story. Some hooks they suggest include sunken treasure, somebody acting peculiarly because they've had their mind taken over by squid beasts, piracy, and romance. The last of which is specifically recommended in connection with merfolk. And I'm like, can't we tell fish people stories that don't involve romance? Can we please
Well,
do
they're
that?
very sexy fish people, remember?
Yeah. I mean, even the Slua diary part, it's like it was a political story, and yet there was still wanton, sexy times mixed in.
Yeah.
Shrug.
Well, there's not a lot of romance then, I guess. It's just the sexy times.
That's true. One-sided romance.
Hmm.
They do also say for Holy Aquatic Chronicles, which they call the most user-friendly of all chronicle options, and I'm thinking, is it? But they do mention the Selkies as another option, as like
Hmm.
a bridge between the land Kithane and the merfolk.
Well, specifically when they say all water chronicles, that is for Changeling, merfolk, selkies.
Yeah.
Uh,
And they give some historical options as well. The
mm,
early Mediterranean. They suggest a retelling of the Odyssey, and I'm like, that would actually be really nifty.
mhm.
And it's been done many times in media, so there's lots of inspiration. But then also Vikings, Caribbean privateers, shout out to some future Storytellers Vault supplement on the topic, and the Steam era.
And then some sample story hooks that don't actually apply to Changeling.
Yeah, like none of them.
Well, one of them I think is very generic and could apply to any game, but
Yeah.
or no, that's talking about wraiths. So never mind.
They had actually useful hooks when they talked about Merfolk Chronicles.
Hmm.
Aquatic fae work well in stories where human contact with a grotto is imminent. Similarly, political intrigues take on a different cast down below, where the mer have less to fear from humans and more from the supernatural menaces that breed unchecked. There you go.
Yep.
Suggestion.
Hmm. Chapter 4 has a bunch of stats for animals, which I actually find kind of handy.
Useful.
Yeah.
Unlike the rest of the chapter.
Spirits less useful for Changeling. Aquatic Fomori. Ancient beasts, the giant squids. It's a little bit like the bygone bestiary thing.
Yeah.
And then a different kind of aquatic Fomori.
And then the Chulorvia. Yeah, the Chulorvia, I get that that's a genre, like undersea, alien horror that some people are into. I've never found it particularly interesting,
Hmm.
but
So does that even apply to changelings? The infection?
I guess it could, but like it very clearly does not seem
Oh, it
designed.
does. They roll glamour or willpower, depending, like basically the best of with either one, and then you get banality and turn into
Yeah, to resist the
fish person.
possession.
Hmm.
It feels so tacked on. I
Hmm.
don't know.
Again, this is reminding me a little bit of some Chronicles of Darkness stuff. Where it's like
Yeah.
cross splat.
If you're into that kind of thing, if you're into squid possessed
Yep.
beasts furthering the goals of their inscrutable squeamish cephalopod masters or whatever, it's here in
Hmm.
chapter 4 for if you want it.
Yep. But also a stat for dolphins.
Also stats for
Laying a dolphin puka. So,
maybe more
yeah.
immediately useful. Speaking of useful mechanics, then we have the appendix.
Yeah. Before that, there's a picture, I think, of the first time I've ever seen an undead parrot. But anyway.
With feathers, weirdly.
Yeah. So we have some new secondary abilities. I'm not even sure Changeling ever had secondary abilities, specific Changeling books.
It did in the player's guide.
Oh, it did? Okay.
The OG player's
So,
guide.
but this is like the first time I recall seeing where secondary abilities, like they have like swimming, which you can also do in athletics, but it's like actually better to take it as a secondary ability. Usually when I see them, you're like, this is just like a more narrow version of another ability that does not actually any better. So I like that at least.
That's something which I know people have homebrewed different strategies for about like treating secondary abilities and specialties as not equivalent, but kind of keying one off of the other.
Hmm.
And I like that method. I think that's
Hmm.
sort of what they were going for here.
Yeah, but your count is basically extra strength, and as
Yeah,
if you had extra
yeah,
strength and
yeah.
stuff. And they have detailed swimming rules.
It's nice that they have the effects of weather conditions in a sidebar.
Hmm.
Important to remember these things.
Detailed rules for diving, floating.
And then so many hazards. Like,
Yeah.
here, it's like several pages on here are all of the ways that you can be taken poorly and possibly die when you're underwater.
Hmm. I mean, I kind of get that.
Yeah, it's just It's a lot. And I mean, trying to keep track of all of these things would be a nightmare.
Yeah, if you look at all the land-based little subsystems we get in the core books.
I guess because it's intuitive to a much smaller readership. Like
Mm-hmm.
most people, when you're reading about like sources of injury for World of Darkness, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, fire, that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. But like we have half a page on oxygen toxicity, which admittedly anyone who's not a diver might not know about.
Yeah, and if even if you have heard of it, doesn't mean you have a system for it.
And even though it has nothing to do with changelings, I do like pressure induced vidi dissociation or
Yeah.
depth sweat, which is, hey, vampires,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you may not need to breathe and you can go underwater, but if you go deep enough, the pressure's just going to start forcing the blood out through your skin.
I wonder if you're around that like warrior host of the Mur, do they start frenzying near you?
Probably. Probably attract every
Yeah.
Rokea within 10 kilometers, too.
Yeah. And then underwater combat rules.
Including weapons, which include the spear gun, which is all I needed from this book.
New merits and flaws, which are like,
Pretty useless, I think.
yeah. And that's this book.
Yeah. On my side, the ads are for Year of the Reckoning. So
Mm-hmm.
this was published at the beginning of 1999. And then the beginning of the Clan novel series, which also started in early 1999.
Mine's a ad. What is on the Onyx Path? Ad for V20 Companion Mage Convention book. What? Why is the Mage Convention book that?
Oh, that
Anyway.
must have been like before M20 came out and they were releasing all of those long delayed revised ones.
Oh, there's one. I don't remember where it was in this book. There's an interesting thing. It came out in what they refer to as Vampire Third Edition, which I've never seen anything else call it that. They talk about how that's introduced bashing and lethal damage,
Yes.
or at least was written before Third Edition, like revised Werewolf or Mage. So,
It definitely, yeah, definitely before Werewolf and Mage, because Vampire Revised, I think, came out in 98.
yep.
So this would have been a few months after that. But Wraith was still around. So, so there is a Wraith section.
There's a lot of Wraith in this
It's
book.
probably one of the last books for Wraith, actually, when you think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny. The books there's a lot of vampire, a lot of wraith,
Mm-hmm.
fair amount of werewolf, fair amount of changeling, very little mage.
Yeah. And even the werewolf stuff is, again, more Rokea than werewolves, but a lot of it is about antagonists that werewolves will face rather than the protagonists themselves.
Yep.
So you get plenty about Fomorian Banes, but not so much on the actual werebeasts you might be playing.
Yeah. Though they were getting a separate Rokea book.
Yes, eventually, yes.
So thoughts.
I'd say it's a solid addition to Changeling.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's necessary if you're planning to do long-term aquatic anything.
Yep.
And it does kind of do crossover better than the main game does.
It's very focused on cross. It's the most crossovery. It does have all 5 of the Ridge 5. So, and even if you're, I don't know, running a mummy game underwater or demon hunter or something, or hunter, it'd still be handy.
If you're looking for watery mummies, I've got a Storyteller's Vault supplement for you.
But yeah, the general, there's a fair amount of things that would be useful regardless of which World of Darkness game you're running underwater.
Yeah.
So, plus, it has the Mur.
Yeah. And more information about them than you're going to get in Z20. For now, at least.
So if you're going to go with an underwater game, I think it would still be handy even in 20th Anniversary Edition.
Yep. Turning to the Discord, we actually didn't have any particular questions that were noted in the chat, but a couple comments that gravitated around really 2 topics, one of which is milk. So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess they could have given them magic shells or something, like to say, oh yeah, if you wear the magic shell, you can breathe underwater. But then when you have a separable item like that, it's like, oh no, what if a baddie grabs and steals your magic shell while you're underwater?
Yeah.
So,
I don't have a problem with, in terms of things I found at all cringy in a Changeling book, this is the tamest.
this is C-list in terms of Changeling cringe.
Yeah.
And is it really any worse? So, there are other sort of mythemes where, for example, if a mermaid makes out with you, then that lets you breathe underwater. Is that better?
Yep.
So
exactly. Yeah, there are questions I have about the details.
Yeah.
You can make that a preview.
The other topic that comments gravitated around were just sort of talking about how every mare is noble, how that would change the dynamics of politics if you were doing something political. And there is the note that the Syrinx are like the noblest of the nobles. But again, this goes back to word count. It would have been great if there was more about their society and their politics discussed.
Yeah.
There was a suggestion in the Discord about having sea bishops, for example. Yay, sea bishops, as like an underclass. And even though that's not in the book, I'm like, that would actually work fine and be really interesting and add dynamics to a fairly monolithic society that we don't get much information about.
There's vague mentions of Chimera, but not, besides his vehicles, doesn't really cover much.
Right.
Which, presumably they have other Chimera, but there's not. It kind of makes me think if you were to run an Arcadia game somehow. I mean, you'd need
Who would do that?
You need a lot of other things, but it's like, everybody there's she noble.
Yeah.
So,
anyway, maybe at some point, some brave soul will do a Storyteller's Vault supplement on the merfolk.
Yeah. But I would have liked it also if they said, oh, they're all nobles. Well, what does that mean if you try to use sovereign on one? Like, what title do you have to be to use sovereign on them? Doesn't say. Things like that. So
there is in the stereotypes section, hang on. The stereotypes sidebar for the merfolk is from a Syrinx Baroness. So she at least has that level of title. Was that title 3?
Yeah.
So
maybe they all have to have title. Okay, it doesn't say that.
I guess.
So. Yeah. When I'm actually thinking about if I were to run a merfolk game or crossover merfolk with Kithane or something, there's some details that I'm just like, I don't have here.
Yes. Pain points.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier with the Maruka because they just live in hives and eat to survive and don't care about much else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a crossover Maruka with a river hag.
Yeah. There you go. That's really what this book is like. It's Gwydion and river hags.
Yep. Gwydion, Elenid, and
Skaha.
Yep.
Yeah. Overall, though, I dig it as a book.
Yeah, it's nothing where I'm like, I need to delete this.
Right.
Like, we've said that before. It's like, it's good what's there. I wish there was a bit more. So,
well, I guess that's all I have for this particular entry.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. You can find us at changelingthepodcast.com. You can email us, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. Please join our Discord where you can talk more about mermilk at discord.me/CTP.
And other topics.
We have a Facebook page, Changeling the Podcast. We have a YouTube channel for Changeling the Podcast. You can send us a toot.
changelingpod@dice.camp.
And is that all?
I think that's everything.
Okay.
You can also float messages in bottles to us, and we'll have our local Melusine pick it up.
Yeah. Once again, I'm Josh.
There are indications that I am Puka.
And remember, don't let your glamour go to 0, else you drown.
You can always tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. We encourage all listeners to consider signing our petition in favor of equal treatment for the long-oppressed sea bishops, who have suffered under unfair conditions in the service of their many-finned lieges for centuries. After all, who studies fastidiously in baleen-vaulted monasteries to better know the squirrely embrace of Vitaea? Who burbles uplifting sermons for the benefit of all mankind in the Coral City's cathedrals? Join us in our struggle to ensure respect and liberation for these lumpen clerics of the theocracy, that they may better enjoy their vocation among the tempestuous and oversexed fish people of the deep. You can contribute to the cause by signing up for our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast, like the following thoughtful types who have already done so: Derek, Torkados, Oreo, Razgabooz, Sanchiger, Sija, Terry Robinson, and Tricerabeth. Feel free to also swing by our Discord at www.discord.me/CTP. We also welcome reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. Here's to the sea and all the flabby theologians it contains, and until next time, keep on dreaming.